Welcome and glad you could be here today because we have got a story that's got a lot of fun stuff in it to talk about, and so I'll get right into it. Um, with the last lesson, in case you happen to see it, you may remember that we were talking about some prophets and what they were saying. Toward the end of the New Testament, they were talking about somebody who was going to show up and work for God. Actually, two people um, were mentioned that were going to show up. And now we're going to find out what they were talking about. Now, for the Jewish people at this time, things had changed a lot. It had been about 400 years since they had last heard a message directly from God. And that's kind of like us now, um, having waited for something since the pilgrims got here. So that was a long time for them to be waiting, but they were used to that and they were faithful in what they believed God would do for them. So, a number of people were still waiting for God. They were still praying for what He had promised to send, who He had promised to send. Well, it turned out that at this time, there was a fellow named Zechariah who was a priest, and he was working in the temple. Now, the way they did things at the temple is that they would have priests rotate in doing the job. Now, the priests were a lot like preachers, but they were all men who were descended from Levi, and that's the same family that Moses had come from. And you may have heard that Moses' brother Aaron was the first priest. So they all had kind of a family tie to being a priest. And because of the duties that were required at the temple, they didn't need all of the priests all of the time, just at certain times of the year when there was a festival. And the rest of the time they would take turns. Well, at this particular time, the group Zechariah was in was working the temple, and they needed somebody to go in and burn incense. Now, incense is something I'll show you. This is some incense that I have. Sometimes you will see incense that come in a little cone shape, and what you do with this is you set fire to it, you blow it out, and then the smoke coming from it will smell nice. And they use that in their worship. Now, in those days, people didn't bathe like they do now. And so there are a lot of people who smell bad much of the time. And of course, they didn't have as much water and soap and things like that. So having some incense burning while they were worshiping God was helpful because it didn't smell quite so bad. Plus, it was one of the things that God had required. Um, that's not required now, but just to give you an idea of how they had that. An incense, when it burns, the smoke can smell nice. It's a lot like a scented candle. So they'll give you some idea of what it was like. So his job, Zechariah's job this day, was to go in and burn incense in the altar, which was a fire that they had for burning sacrifices. Well, the way he'd gotten the job is that uh, they had cast lots. That's a little bit like us saying putting names into a hat and drawing a name out to see who has the job, or doing eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Anyway, he got picked, and it seems like this was not an accident that it turned out to be Zechariah because he got in there, he's doing his job apparently by himself, and suddenly there's an angel, and the angel says what angels always say, almost always say, when they first show up to people to talk to them is, don't be afraid. Uh, because the first thing that happens when he sees an angel is he's afraid. He's wondering what's going on. And the angel says, I've got good news for you. Um, God has heard your prayer, and you are going to have a child. Now, what we find out as we read through this first chapter of Luke is that Zechariah was getting pretty old, and his wife was too, of course, and they had not been able to have children. And nowadays, if you find some ladies um, who are not real young, as they get older, many of them want to have children, and if they can't have a baby, then they can get pretty sad. Well, in those days, it was even worse because if you didn't have a baby and you were a married lady, and after a while, people think, okay, God must be mad at this person, or this person's done something wrong and is being punished. Of course, that wasn't the case, but that's what people would think, and it's hard to change people's minds once they get this idea. Well, his wife Elizabeth was also from the major family of Levi, and the angel says, you and Elizabeth are doing everything well. You've been following God, and He's going to grant you a child. It's going to be a son. You're going to have a boy, and you are to name him John. And we've got some special rules that we have for this child because he is going to be a joy to you. He is going to work for God. He's going to bring people back to God. He'll be just like the prophet Elijah. And one thing though, um, he's not to have any wine or any other fermented drink. And his mentioning that has something to do from the Old Testament called a Nazarite. And Nazarite vows would be people who might, for their whole life or for just a certain amount of time, would dedicate their service to God. And everything they did during that time would be working for God. Well, what the angel's indicating is that John is going to be God's man forever, meaning even before he was born, he was going to have God's Spirit upon him and be led by God. And so, this sounds great because this is kind of even more than Zechariah and Elizabeth have asked for. But Zechariah says, okay, how can I be sure this is going to happen? I'm pretty old. My wife's pretty old. Well, the angel goes, I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. Now, this tells Zechariah a couple of things. One, that he's standing in the presence of God, meaning that he's not just any old angel. I mean, as if there's any such thing as any old angel. He's one of the top angels, and he's right there delivering messages directly from God to the person who's supposed to get it. Also, Zechariah, as a priest, knows that Gabriel had once gone and talked to Daniel to pass along a message. Now, that's important because we don't know the names of but two angels who are mentioned in the Bible. There's Michael and then there's Gabriel. And this is an angel Zechariah knows about because he's a priest. He's been studying God's words and the scriptures most of his life. So he should know this. And maybe Zechariah realizes he's in trouble. And sure enough, he is. Gabriel says, all of this is going to happen, as I've told you, but because you didn't believe me, you're not going to be able to talk until after the baby's born. And with that, he's gone. And Zechariah can't talk. Now, what is said here also could mean that he couldn't hear, and it's very likely that he was also deaf. Because he goes out of there and the people see that something's happened, but he can't tell them what happened. But he's making motions with his hands and all that, and they say, okay, he's seen something in there. Well, his time of service at the temple ends. He goes back home, and sure enough, before long, Elizabeth finds that she's going to have a baby. Well, she must have been able to read and all because she knows that the baby is to be named John. And so Zechariah would have had to have written it down for her to see that. So she kind of stays in seclusion to sort of hide the fact that she's expecting a baby. We're not really sure why she would do that instead of going around and telling people, but it's quite possible that she realizes that this was something important done by God. Now, definitely Zechariah did, because after this punishment that he got, he would have remembered the story of Abraham and Sarah and the same thing happening with them when they are visited and told that they're going to have a son and they both think they're too old to have one. So that's one of the reasons I think Zechariah was in trouble, because he should have remembered this before and that God had done something similar and could do it again if he wanted to. All right. So in the story, the scene changes a little bit, and we find that there's in Nazareth, there's a girl named Mary who is pledged to be married to a fellow named Joseph. Now, with the marriages back then, usually if they did things the way they were supposed to, the way they wanted to from their culture, it would take a year to get married. So you would say you were engaged, and then it was counted that you were married, but you would stay with your own family for that year until they finally had the ceremony, and then you would be together from then on. Well, she's pledged to Joseph, and guess who shows up? Gabriel. Well, this time he's pretty excited. He says, "Oh, greetings to you who are most favored by the Lord." And she's going, "What in the world is this?" See, apparently even angels can get so excited that they forget to tell people not to be afraid. And uh, that's the next thing he says, because he realizes that she's troubled. She doesn't know what he's talking about. And he says, "Don't be afraid." He goes, "I'm Gabriel. I'm here to tell you that God has been watching you, and you're going to have a son, and you're to name him Jesus." Now, the name Jesus can be different depending on what language you're speaking. So it's the same name as the name Joshua. So that's just something for you to know that your parents may not know. So the name Jesus is the same as the name Joshua, just a different language. And he tells her some of the same things. It sounds like what was said about John, but it's even bigger than that. And the whole deal is that John is going to prepare things for Jesus, who is going to come along. And we find out that this Jesus that he's talking about is going to be called the Son of the Most High. And not just that, he'll be known as the Son of God. Now, that's a big deal. And in fact, Gabriel says he's going to be great. Well, she's going, "Wait, wait, wait. I don't understand how this can happen, because I'm not, completely married yet. I'm not with my husband." And he goes, "Oh, don't worry about that. God's going to take care of that." And she says, "Okay, I'll do whatever God wants me to do." And he says, "Oh, by the way, your cousin Elizabeth um, is about 6 months into uh, expecting a child. And so another 3 months, she's going to be having a baby." Well, Mary heads on over there to visit Elizabeth, and stays with her for 3 months, but leaves just before John is born. Now, one of the funny things is that um, the baby hears Mary's voice, and babies can hear things before they're even born, and somehow knows that Mary is special and jumps, and Elizabeth knows this too. Well, Mary heads back home, and John is born. And on the eighth day, they're doing the circumcision ceremony for him being a boy, and they're saying, "Okay, what are we going to name him?" And somebody is suggesting that they name him Zechariah after his dad. And and she's going, "No, no, name him John." And they say, "There's not anybody in your family named John." And finally, Zechariah motions for something to write with, and he writes on it, "His name is John," and turns it around, and people are surprised. Well, at that point, suddenly Zechariah can talk again. And everybody's amazed by that. And the name of this baby is John. Now, there are big things that are about to happen after this, but I'm going to close it down for now, and we'll cover more in the next lesson. Just wanted you to know I'm wearing this tie, a white tie, because I don't have a tie made of light. Because when angels show up, there's generally the idea that there's a lot of light there, and this is the brightest one I could get. So I'm going to stop with that. Hope you picked up something from this, and we'll talk a little bit more next week as it gets even more exciting. Hope to see you then. Bye.